For decades, the heavy metal underground thrived on a unique combination of raw sonic violence and unyielding personal discipline. While fans in the mosh pits witnessed what appeared to be total, unrestrained musical chaos on stage, the architects behind the scenes knew that surviving the grueling touring schedules required an immense amount of internal structure. Tom Araya, the grounded frontman of Slayer, embodied this quiet professionalism, anchoring a band that pushed the absolute boundaries of sonic extremity while maintaining a strict, reliable work ethic behind the curtain. On the other side of the California thrash scene stood Dave Mustaine, a musical genius of unparalleled technical capability whose creative fire was permanently fueled by a deep, combustible sense of rejection and fierce competitive drive. These two towering figures helped define the sonic landscape of an entire generation, marching onto the same musical battlefield but operating under completely incompatible personal and professional codes of conduct. As the years progressed, what began as a mutual respect between two pioneering forces gradually transformed into a calculated, permanent distance that defined their relationship. The story of their quiet estrangement is not merely a tale of rock star egos clashing in the media, but rather a fascinating study in how contrasting temperaments can permanently alter the trajectory of creative partnerships. To truly understand the deep-seated ideological divide that eventually grew between these two thrash metal titans, one must look closely at the wildly different environments that shaped their formative years in the music industry. Before Slayer ever secured a major record deal or toured the global stage, Tom Araya was living a dual life that forced him to develop a profound respect for stability, time management, and real-world responsibility. Working long, exhausting shifts as a certified respiratory therapist in Southern California hospitals, Araya spent his daylight hours caring for critically ill patients who were fighting for their very breath. Once his medical shifts concluded, he would immediately transition into the dark, aggressive world of underground metal, driving across town to rehearse late into the night with his bandmates. This intense, demanding lifestyle instilled in him a foundational belief that commitments were sacred and that professionalism was non-negotiable, regardless of how extreme the artistic expression might be. Inside the Slayer camp, internal disagreements and fiery creative disputes between strong personalities like Kerry King and Jeff Hanneman were certainly common occurrences, but they were always managed through a strict internal code of reliability. The music they created was deliberately designed to sound like an uncontrollable storm, but the actual machinery operating the band was always running with military-grade precision. In stark contrast to Araya's structured upbringing, Dave Mustaine's journey through the formative years of the American thrash metal movement was defined by a volatile mixture of sudden trauma, public humiliation, and an obsessive desire for personal vindication. After being abruptly dismissed from Metallica during their early days in New York due to unpredictable behavior and severe substance issues, Mustaine found himself on a long, bitter bus ride back west with nothing but his thoughts and burning resentment. This painful experience did not break him. Instead, it acted as a nuclear fuel source that sparked the creation of Megadeth, a musical entity designed with the explicit purpose of outperforming everyone else. Mustaine did not just want to succeed in the music business. He wanted to be faster, more complex, and significantly more technical than his former bandmates and every other contemporary in the emerging scene. Masterpieces like their early underground releases proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that he possessed the genuine musical brilliance and jaw-dropping guitar architecture to back up his immense anger. His songwriting carried an intellectual bite, and his complex picking style set a brand new benchmark for what thrash guitar work could achieve. However, alongside this undeniable creative brilliance lived an unpredictable emotional volatility that frequently disrupted the internal stability of his own project. As both Slayer and Megadeth rose through the ranks of the global underground, the broader thrash metal movement began to realize that its long-term survival depended entirely on mutual professionalism. Alongside Metallica and Anthrax, these bands were collectively building a massive, highly lucrative cultural phenomenon that required immense logistical cooperation, shared stages, and coordinated global tour. While fierce creative rivalries certainly existed between the camps, there was a baseline understanding that the financial and cultural growth of the metal scene required everyone to show up and perform their duties reliably. Promoters, booking agents, and record label executives were investing significant resources into these aggressive packages, meaning that emotional instability could quickly translate into devastating financial losses for everyone involved. When a highly anticipated joint studio collaboration was proposed in Los Angeles during the mid-1980s, fans and industry insiders genuinely believed they were about to witness a historic unification of two metal giants. The project made perfect commercial sense on paper, as Slayer had just stunned the industry with the terrifying speed of their landmark album, while Megadeth was establishing itself as a technical powerhouse. Unfortunately, this highly anticipated meeting would soon become the definitive moment, where the theoretical difference between Araya's measured discipline and Mustaine's unpredictable energy collided in a disastrously unforgettable fashion. The carefully scheduled meeting in the heart of Los Angeles was supposed to be a straightforward corporate affair where managers, label representatives, and musicians could smoothly coordinate their upcoming creative endeavors. The members of Slayer arrived at the recording studio precisely on time, showcasing their characteristic focus, with Tom Araya calm, Kerry King direct, Jeff Hanneman observant, and Dave Lombardo fully prepared to work. David Ellefson was also present, attempting to reassure the waiting room that his Megadeth bandmate was on his way. But as the minutes turned into hours, the collective mood inside the room soured significantly. When Mustaine finally walked through the studio doors visibly compromised by intoxication, the atmosphere immediately shifted from quiet irritation to palpable defensive tension. Rather than working to ease into the delicate business negotiations, the conversation almost instantly derailed into highly confrontational critiques regarding Slayer's recent creative direction and production choices. The breaking point arrived with shocking speed when Mustaine grabbed Kerry King's highly prized, custom-built guitar and forcefully smashed it against the nearby studio equipment, fracturing the wood and instantly shattering any remaining hope for professional collaboration. In that single, chaotic moment, a highly lucrative artistic partnership died before it ever had a chance to begin, leaving Tom Araya with a permanent realization that some boundaries once crossed can never be restored. Part 2. The immediate aftermath of the disastrous Los Angeles studio incident did not result in a highly publicized media war or a series of dramatic retaliatory statements in the underground press. Both Slayer and Megadeth were operating at a high level where public mudslinging could potentially jeopardize their standing with major distributors and conservative radio networks. Instead, a deliberate, heavy silence descended upon the situation as both camps focused entirely on their respective, relentless touring cycles and highly successful album releases. To the average heavy metal fan watching from the outside, it appeared as though nothing of major consequence had occurred, as both bands continued to dominate the charts and push boundaries. Yet beneath that smooth, professional exterior, a fundamental shift had taken place in how Tom Araya viewed the prospect of ever sharing a creative space with Dave Mustaine again. What followed was not an active, aggressive feud, but rather a cold, calculated policy of permanent professional distance that would endure for the remainder of their long careers. Araya chose to completely withdraw his trust, deciding that while he would always recognize Mustaine's immense artistic gifts, he would never again expose his own band's operations to that level of unpredictability. When the two bands were inevitably booked on the exact same large-scale festival lineups or high-profile co-headlining packages over the following years, their interactions were kept to an absolute bare minimum. Contracts were strictly honored, soundchecks were coordinated through tour managers, and both groups delivered highly explosive performances that left stadium audiences completely thrilled and oblivious to the backstage reality. Behind the heavy velvet curtains, however, the warmth and camaraderie that typically characterized the tightly knit thrash metal community were noticeably absent between the two lead vocalists. Araya and Mustaine would engage in nothing more than basic, formal civility, a polite nod in the hallway, a brief handshake before walking to their dressing rooms, but absolutely no extended conversations. During the iconic and highly celebrated Clash of the Titans tour, this underlying quiet tension was incredibly obvious to any industry insiders or crew members who were paying close attention to the backstage dynamics. Araya would later clarify to music journalists that there was no active, burning hatred consuming his thoughts on a daily basis, but rather a pragmatic decision to protect his personal peace of mind. Whenever reporters tried to bait Araya into launching a furious public attack against Mustaine, the Slayer frontman would simply laugh it off with a demeanor that acknowledged the messy history without validating the drama. He famously remarked in an interview that he harbored no deep, toxic grudge, but wryly noted that whenever he encountered Mustaine, he was simply waiting to see what inflammatory comment would come out of his mouth next. This revealing perspective showed that Araya's primary concern was not a single, isolated outburst from the mid-1980s, but rather a clear, repeating behavioral pattern that seemed to define Mustaine's entire public existence. Over the course of several decades, Mustaine would routinely make highly controversial, biting remarks about his musical peers, former bandmates, or competing groups in major magazine features. Then, after the inevitable industry backlash and public relations fallout arrived, a formal apology or detailed clarification would be issued, only for the exact same cycle to start all over again a few months later. To a structured, highly predictable individual like Araya, this constant state of public volatility felt entirely exhausting and counterproductive to the longevity of the scene. In the highly competitive and interconnected ecosystem of international rock touring, predictability is not a minor luxury. It is the absolute foundation upon which multi-million-dollar operations are built. A single unhinged moment or sudden backstage meltdown can trigger a massive domino effect, leading to canceled shows, ruined equipment, furious promoters, and catastrophic financial liabilities for everyone involved. Because of these immense stakes, prominent festival organizers and major record labels closely monitor the personal stability and reliable reputation of their top-tier headlining artists. When a legendary performer is widely perceived as a loose cannon or an unpredictable risk, major collaborative ventures quickly become a massive gamble that many conservative executives are simply unwilling to take. Tom Araya never once allowed his personal caution to cloud his objective judgment regarding Mustaine's historical importance or his jaw-dropping technical precision on the fretboard. He openly acknowledged that Megadeth helped pioneer a brilliant, complex style of heavy music that inspired thousands of young guitarists around the world to pick up the instrument. However, Araya firmly believed that artistic admiration should never be confused with blind trust, creating a permanent boundary that kept his personal life completely insulated from the drama. This unwavering commitment to brutal honesty and maintaining a drama-free environment was deeply woven into the very fabric of Slayer's collective identity from their very first day in the garage. In numerous archival interviews dating back to the late 1980s, both Tom Araya and Kerry King repeatedly made it clear to the music press that genuine originality mattered infinitely more than mainstream commercial popularity. When asked for their candid thoughts on the massive wave of younger thrash bands flooding the scene, Araya bluntly stated that he refused to waste his time listening to groups that sounded completely derivative. King would frequently double down on these sentiments, asserting that lazy imitation of established acts was the single fastest way to completely lose the respect of veteran musicians. For the members of Slayer, the aggressive thrash metal subculture was never a theatrical costume they put on for fame, but rather an authentic, dead-serious expression of their true identities. This unyielding standard of absolute authenticity naturally extended to how they evaluated their elite peers within the Big Four, creating a rigid set of expectations that very few individuals could ever fully satisfy over the long haul. Part 3. As the heavy metal media landscape continued to evolve into the digital age, journalists frequently tried to contrast the internal dynamics of Metallica with the highly public controversies surrounding Megadeth. Slayer's members openly praised Metallica's historical musicianship, and often acknowledged the deep, foundational friendships that had connected their respective bands during the early days of the underground tape-trading network. Even when Metallica made massive, highly controversial creative shifts in the 1990s that alienated their core fanbase, Slayer viewed those decisions as internal creative choices rather than public spectacles. When directly pressed by a radio host years later to choose his definitive preference between Metallica and Megadeth, Kerry King famously joked that Metallica actually had a real singer, delivering a sharp piece of humor that perfectly highlighted the underlying preference of the Slayer camp. This witty remark cut straight to a deeper, fundamental truth about how both bands managed their public images and handled internal friction. While Metallica's deep-seated interpersonal conflicts were certainly intense and well-documented, they generally managed to keep their darkest moments contained within their own inner circle or formal therapy sessions. Mustaine's bitter disagreements, conversely, regularly spilled out into front-page magazine headlines, music video sets, and confrontational radio interviews, turning personal grievances into highly public battlegrounds. Tom Araya watched this endless cycle of media-driven chaos unfold from a safe, comfortable distance, refusing to ever grant the press the sensationalized headlines they desperately wanted from him. He realized early on that participating in public feuds only served to legitimize the disorder and drain the valuable creative energy needed to keep his own band performing at an elite level. The core issue, in Araya's analytical view, was remarkably simple. Careless words were spoken without regard for consequences, followed by a predictable apology, only for the exact same offensive behavior to be repeated down the line. This specific, recurring rhythm completely eroded personal credibility and made it impossible to establish a meaningful professional foundation. In Araya's strict vocabulary, true respect was not an abstract concept. It was a practical attribute demonstrated through absolute consistency, reliability under intense pressure, and honoring your word. It meant that when you walked into a high-stakes business meeting or a crowded recording studio to conduct professional business, you did not let emotional impulses burn the entire structure down. Once an individual proved they were entirely capable of destroying a collaborative project on a whim, Araya believed that attempting to rebuild that shattered trust was an exercise in futility. When explicitly pressed by a prominent biographer near the end of his touring career regarding whether he respected Dave Mustaine as a human being, Araya offered a remarkably nuanced response that perfectly explained his lifelong stance. He did not hesitate for a single second to praise Mustaine's incredible work ethic, his undeniable drive, and the sheer resilience required to build a legendary band from the ashes of public rejection. He genuinely understood how difficult it must have been to be cast aside by Metallica, and then instantly summoned the immense strength required to forge a rival musical empire that achieved global acclaim. Yet immediately after offering this praise, Araya drew a clear, sharp line in the sand, noting that respecting someone's monumental professional achievements does not automatically mean you have to trust them in your personal space. This crucial distinction was completely devoid of petty theatrical drama. Instead, it was a deeply practical philosophy that allowed Araya to navigate the music industry without collecting toxic grudges. When Slayer occasionally agreed to share festival stages with Megadeth for historic anniversary events, Araya would sometimes joke to reporters that Mustaine was incredibly lucky those massive shows were even happening. Behind that lighthearted backstage humor was a long, unyielding memory of a ruined studio session, a shattered custom instrument, and a massive commercial opportunity that had been completely erased by erratic behavior. More importantly, it reflected a mature, highly developed sense of personal boundaries that refused to sacrifice long-term emotional stability for short-term media attention or superficial industry reconciliations. For a steady, rock-solid musician who predicated his entire 40-year career on showing up prepared, performing flawlessly, and treating crews with dignity, unpredictability was not an exciting rock-and-roll trait. Over the course of several decades, Araya consistently chose a much quieter, far more powerful path of resistance than the explosive confrontations many metal fans typically expected from the genre's top figures. He never launched a furious, expletive-laden counterattack in the press, nor did he allow himself to be drawn into endless, exhausting debates across modern social media platforms. He simply withdrew his energy entirely, ensuring that backstage interactions remained brief and formal, while completely avoiding any future collaborative business ventures that carried unnecessary risk. When looking back at this fascinating chapter of rock history through an objective lens, the enduring distance between these two legendary frontmen is no longer just about a single wild afternoon in a Los Angeles recording studio. It serves as a timeless, powerful cautionary tale regarding what that specific afternoon represented to the hardworking musicians, road crews, and business partners who kept the thrash scene alive. In the uncompromising world of extreme metal, musical intensity was highly celebrated, and fierce artistic competition was considered completely healthy, but absolute reliability was viewed as something deeply sacred. When a headline act formally committed to a massive global tour, an expensive studio album, or a joint promotional campaign, hundreds of working-class people depended entirely on those agreements for their livelihoods. A single sudden meltdown or impulsive action could instantly trigger a massive financial ripple effect that harmed audio engineers, lighting technicians, truck drivers, and local venue promoters. Tom Araya's quiet, dignified restraint over the decades is precisely what makes his definitive perspective on the matter so incredibly resonant and respected within the global music community today. He chose to let his silent, permanent distance speak volumes, proving that in an industry completely obsessed with generating loud headlines, maintaining personal control is the ultimate statement of power.